Perhaps you have a specific memory. Maybe it's just a general sense. You may vividly remember who it was who said it to you, or maybe it wasn't said, and the silence was worse. But regardless, I have no doubt that all of us have had experience with being shamed. As a kid, you told a lie or talked back to your parent. You forgot to do a chore or did poorly on a test. And someone older and bigger than you made you feel like not only did you do something wrong, but there was something wrong with you. After you apologized, after you were punished, when you were sitting alone in your room, that thick, hot shame filled your body and told you that you were unfixable, unlovable, and just wrong. It's so easy for us to believe those lies, to internalize them and be absolutely convinced that we are not good enough and will never be good enough. It's a wound that festers and so often follows us into our adulthood, affecting our relationships with others and distorting our own sense of self. This week's gospel begins with shame. It begins with Peter on a boat in the Sea of Tiberias battling his shame. Peter, impetuous and brave, who wanted a full body bath at the foot washing, who in the garden drew his sword to cut off the ear of the high priest's slave. Peter, who boldly proclaimed that he would lay down his life for Jesus. But on that awful night when Jesus was arrested and he was warming himself by that charcoal fire, he could not bring himself to admit that he was a disciple of Jesus. Peter, who was ashamed to admit who he really was, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Peter, whose shame began long before this day on the boat, but surely has been gnawing just under the surface ever since that fateful night. Now, it's important to remember that John tells the story of Peter's denial a little bit differently than the other Gospels. In the other Gospels, at that arrest scene, the question asked to Peter is, "Do you know the man? Do you know Jesus?" To which Peter responds, "I do not know him." But in John, the question is different. "Aren't you one of his disciples?" To which Peter says, "I am not." So in a way, Peter does not deny Jesus here. He denies his own identity. He denies who he is, who God has called him to be. And that is, of course, what shame does. It makes us doubt ourselves, question our ability to be the person that God has created and called us to be. Perhaps that night at that fire, Peter had already felt like he had failed as a disciple. Shame had taken over and told him he wasn't good enough. He would never be good enough. He wasn't a good enough disciple. He was not a real disciple. And now, Jesus has appeared to the disciples twice. Peter's convinced that he did indeed rise from the dead, but it seems like the shame about who he is and what he's done is still there. So that complicated, wounded Peter returns to his fishing boat. He retreats to something that is comfortable and familiar, which is what we all do when we're feeling ashamed, right? Go to something that seems safe, that we know what to do, that makes us feel like we're competent people. Maybe if he just gets back out on the water, he can escape the shame, escape the hurt, avoid the possibility of having to look Jesus in the eyes and admit what he's done and who he is or who he isn't. And there's a beautiful moment here when Peter says, I'm going fishing, and it sounds like he's going to go by himself. And the disciples say, we're going with you. It's so easy to let shame convince us that we need to isolate ourselves, right? Because shame transforms all of our wishes and our longings to be seen and known into fear of being exposed or humiliated or rejected. So it's easy to just withdraw. But his friends say, no, Peter, we are all in this together. You are still a disciple with us, and we are going with you. Except that night of fishing came up empty. Another failure. Perhaps Peter saw it as another example of how he'd never be quite good enough. But then dawn breaks. Jesus shows up. A miraculous catch of fish occurs, and Peter finds himself, breathless and soaked, sitting by a charcoal fire. Again, facing 3 costly questions. Again. Jesus asks these questions that take Peter right to the heart of his shame. But Jesus doesn't do that in order to further shame him. He does it because we have to go to that place of hurt to be able to be healed. We can't just ignore an infected wound, right? We need to treat it with a salve that will make it heal and whole again. Debbie Thomas writes, what I find both searing and instructive in this story is the way Jesus saves Peter by returning him to the source of his shame. He doesn't wrap the humiliated disciple in gauze. He doesn't avoid the hard conversation. He doesn't pretend that Peter's denials didn't happen and didn't wound. But neither does Jesus preach, condemn, accuse, or retaliate. He feeds. He feeds Peter's body, and then he feeds Peter's soul. He surrounds the self-loathing disciple with tenderness and safety, inviting him to revisit his shame for the sake of healing, restoration, and commissioning. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Feed my sheep. And Peter's response here, I think, is telling. When Jesus says, do you love me? He doesn't say, I love you back, right? Maybe he doesn't quite trust himself yet. Instead, he says, you know that I love you. You know that I love you. Peter realizes that it's not what we think about who we are that matters most. It's not what we think. It's what Jesus knows about us that matters. And Jesus knows that we are beloved children of God. That's what he calls his disciples, after all. When he stands on the shore and calls to them, children, he says, cast your nets again. You were made to live and love with your whole heart, and I am here to feed and nourish you, to heal and restore you, to remind you of who you really are and who I am calling you to be. I read once that the opposite of shame is not autonomy or confidence, but the restoration of our capacity for relatedness and intimacy. I'll say that again. The opposite of shame is the restoration of our capacity for relatedness and intimacy. Mutuality involves openness to receive the other with empathy and understanding, and the experience of being received, held in mind, and recognized as our own person. That is what Jesus does here in this interaction with Peter. He restores him to be able to have a relationship with God and with the other disciples. And then he calls Peter to do the same. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep. Jesus is asking Peter to accept who he really is and who Jesus needs him to be. And Jesus asks us to accept and embrace who we really are and who Jesus needs us to be. For we are God's children, chosen, holy, and precious. We are made to love and reconcile and heal and live abundantly. Don't let shame or anybody else tell you otherwise. We can trust what God believes about us. And as we do, we can hear Jesus call all the more clearly. Follow me, he says. Amen.